Things that have changed, and not so much for you guys, I guess, but you guys remember the WAC, de minimis WAC, talks about de minimis use. I think it was 292.110-10, something like that. It was a WAC talked about de minimis use, and there in the bottom of there in section 5 there was about 6 or 7 prohibited things that you couldn't use state resources for. You guys remember that? Well, if you don't, that's okay because it's gone now. So if you didn't, if you thought it was there or didn't know it was there, it's okay. And it's gone from the WAC, but it doesn't mean that the board still can't strictly prohibit things, right? Things like doing outside business, things like taking equipment home and using it, things that maybe were listed as strictly prohibited, and now they just can't be listed in the WAC, but the law itself is very restrictive. So the court said that the board couldn't give you strictly prohibited uses of resources. They couldn't do that. That was beyond their authority to do. All they could do was give exceptions to the law, the 160, the resource rule. And it's very restrictive. And we're going to see it later today, but you'll see basically what it says. If you use any state resource for a personal reason, it's a violation of the law. So it's very restrictive. So the folks in Olympia knew that it was very restrictive, so they gave the board authority to write exceptions to that rule. And they did. They wrote the de minimis use rule, which we'll talk about. So really, under certain circumstances, you can use resources a little bit, and it's okay. It has to follow within those de minimis guidelines, which we'll talk about. But there's certain things that even if you use them just once, okay, are going to be a violation of the Ethics Act. And mostly that comes down to conducting private business at work, and that just makes sense. The board doesn't want you to do that. Okay. What else? Types of violations that we're seeing mostly. It's use of resources is still the top violation that we were seeing. More so now it's time. Time is the resource, and we're seeing people abuse time a lot. And it may be going back to the entitlement part of it, right? The other one we're seeing is conflicts of interest and special privileges in the area of hiring people. So if we're in that position where we get to hire folks and we're hiring our relatives and our best friends into positions and we're not going through the right process to do that, or we're participating in that process and maybe we should have recused ourselves from it up front, then that could be a problem with the board. Okay, so that's where we said, did you have a question? Oh, okay. All right, so any questions on where we're at with the board? Any thoughts on where we might be going? And we're going to talk a lot more about this as we get going. But if you have any questions now, all right, here we go. That was the law back in 2013, and a couple of changes did happen to the law in 2013. Not so much to the violations, but to the administrative part, and it changed a couple things. One, this was the time we went to Olympia and we tried to get Olympia to put into the law that this type of training was mandatory for all state agencies, right? Because if the board's going to hold people accountable to the rules, we thought then, at least we should make it mandatory for agencies to provide the training. They said, no, we're not going to make it a mandatory thing, but we were going to say it's recommended, right? So now agencies are not mandated to provide training, but it's recommended that they do. New employees get training right away within the first week or so of their employment, and then 3 years after that, they get some type of refresher training. That's kind of the recommendation, but agencies can do a lot more training than that, or a lot less, or really, if they really wanted to, they could provide no training at all if they wanted to. That was that law. Again, overtime and time has been the issue lately. I'll talk real briefly about a case that we had involving a State Patrol lieutenant up in the Bellevue area. So maybe you guys have heard about this. This was probably a few years ago. Lieutenant with the Washington State Patrol. He was in charge of contracts that were given to the State Patrol through DOT and Washington Traffic Safety to do traffic type emphasis, DUI emphasis, speed emphasis, those kinds of things. And there was probably 10, 15 other contracts that were kind of distributed with the other lieutenants in the district. And all those other lieutenants that had those contracts, when they doled out the overtime, they did it through a list. They created a list, and if you, as a trooper, wanted to put in overtime, you'd put your name on the list, and as your name came up, you'd be offered the overtime, right? And that was the normal, and it seemed a fair way to do it. But his contracts, he didn't have a list. He gave it to the people he knew, and he gave it to him most of the time. 50% of the contracts, he did the overtime, right? Because he could, because as a lieutenant, he could adjust his shift whenever he wanted to. He didn't have to work a regular assigned shift. So the troopers, that really was the intent of the contract, right? We want to get the job done with the least amount of money and with the most people that's going to affect it the most. The lieutenant makes probably almost 2 times as much as a trooper, and they haven't worked the road for a long time. So is that the guy you went out there doing your DUI emphasis? Probably not, but he was out there most of the time collecting that money. So that was abuse of time, and a lot of overtime that he submitted turned out that he really didn't do the overtime at all. So he was, of course, as a lieutenant, you can sign off your own worksheet, timesheet, and it wasn't being checked very good. So there was a lot of that. The board found him in violation, and this is one of the only times I've found the board where they really went to that level of $5,000 per violation. We settled with him at $60,000 for his violation. The board wanted a lot more than that. If he would have gone to the board for a hearing, he would be looking at about $400,000 if that was what they were thinking. I first brought it to the board at $25,000, thinking that would be a fair settlement, and they said, "Nuh-uh, we want more. We want more. That's not enough." He had padded his. Oh, that's the whole thing. He was padding his last 2 years retirement, so he was padding his overtime. So even though we could fine him for that, we couldn't take his retirement away from him. So he's making over maybe the life of his. He padded his retirement $1,000 extra a month just from all the overtime that he did. So you can see how much money over time that he's going to get back from his retirement benefit for these types of violations. Okay, let's get on to the meat at hand here. Any questions so far? All right, we're getting into the good stuff. But before we do, I guess we're going to test your knowledge and see where you're at right now. So, try to get someplace where everybody can see that. And if I can see it, I can read it. So you are an instructor for the University of Washington. You also own a painting company that you run out of your house. During the summer, your paint business gets very busy, and you need to hire extra help to get the work done. Several students from your current summer class want to work part-time for you. Can you hire these summertime students to come paint houses for you? Does anybody think that's okay? Does anybody say yes there?
The UW is kind of iffy, but the rest.
Okay, so why do you think it's not okay to hire your summertime students?
Interest with the students in my class.
And why is it a conflict?
Power and control over those students and what I can do with them.
Very good, and that's exactly what the board, when they look at this, that's exactly what they think. As an instructor, professor of a class, believe it or not, you have control over those students. You have control over their grades. You have control over if they come to class and actually do the work that all the other students are working. So you have some influence over their grade. So the board says if you regulate somebody, and I know a lot of folks don't like the word regulate when it comes to your students or maybe even your employees, but in a sense you do regulate them. And if you regulate them, you can't enter into any type of business transactions with them, right? So even your students, so you can't enter into any business transaction or be a conflict of interest, okay? Any other thoughts on that? All right, that was an easy one. So, you know that your agency will be surplusing some computer equipment next month. You and a friend run a small business, and a friend asks that you let him know when the equipment is to be surplus and available for bid. The general public will be informed of the surplus property next week, giving them only 2 days to determine if they want to bid on the property. You are having lunch with your friend and business partner today, and you give him the list of equipment. Is this a violation? Okay, what violation might you think? I mean, we all know it's kind of not a good thing. Special privilege, anything else?
Well, you give your friend an unfair advantage over his competition.
Okay, so that would be a special privilege. That's what we're talking about there. But what else? There's a couple other things that we could look at here too. This is one of those. What's that?
Yeah,
If you're up and running the company, it's to your.
So you're getting some financial gain from it, right? So that's another one we can look at. So and this is one of those violations that if we look at, we can really find a couple different violations. We can find special privilege, we can find conflicts of interest, and a financial gain, financial interest, and then the last one is conflict of interest. So this violation, there's really 3 different ethics violations that are being violated here. Okay, does everybody see that or have questions or concerns with that? All right. One of your employees sells Avon products on the side to coworkers. The employee hands out catalogs in the workplace and distributes orders during lunch hour and during break times. Is this a violation? No. Any yeses?
Well, is the employee given the catalogs during their work time, or?
Well, it's given to them on her break time. Okay, not necessarily the employee's break time, but at least it's on her break, or his break. Doesn't really say. So what do you guys think? We got some, no, it's not a violation to... Okay, agency policy can't allow this, okay? So even if there's so the answer to this is, this is a violation. And this is why it's a violation. This is one of those areas that the board, it's one of those strictly prohibited violations where a use of a resource to promote an outside business or conduct your own business, right? Is the person who's selling Avon, are they going to make a profit, some business profit from selling at work? So the board looks at that and says, you cannot use any state resources to conduct your own business at work. Any. So what's the resource that's being used here? She's not using time, right? Because that's being done maybe on her break time, or it's the space, right? It's the building that she's in. It's the opportunity to be able to have all these people to pass out pamphlets to at work, right?
Does this apply to something like Girl Scout cookies?
That's the logical next question. And so what do you think, guys? We'll break this up into two groups. This is a for-profit company, right? Somebody's going to make a profit. And Girl Scouts are considered nonprofit, right? So is there a difference? Do you think the board looks at those as a difference?
Yes.
No.
There's a statement in here that says nonprofit right in the whole rest.
Yeah, they don't. But they do give your agency director or head president some discretion here. So if your president decides that the Girl Scout Cookies is a good organization and kind of coincides with the mission of the college, then they may say, okay, we're going to allow employees to use the minimum amount of resources to support the Girl Scouts. And what that means is that if I'm selling Girl Scout cookies for my daughter, I can bring a sign-up sheet maybe, and I can put that in the break room. And as people come in on their breaks, if they want to sign up for Girl Scout cookies, they can. And then I can somehow distribute them on break or whatever when they come in. It doesn't mean that I can spend all day selling Girl Scout cookies at work. I can't come in and start printing off flyers and posting them all over the workplace. I can't go around and I can't solicit sales from folks. I can't go around to everybody's desk or cubicle and say, can you buy some cookies from my daughter? Okay, can't do that. The minimum amount of resources. But it has to be in writing from the president, right? It can't just be a verbal agreement. It can't be something where an employee comes to you and asks if they can do it. You can't give that permission. It has to be the president or the president's designee is the only people that can give that permission, and it has to be in writing someplace, either in a policy or some type of directive. Some agencies are very vague in their policies to allow that. Some are very specific. Washington State DOT, they have in their policy regarding nonprofit organizations, they have about 4 that are listed, and so de minimis use can be used for those 4 nonprofits, and everything else cannot be used. So again, it depends on what your president or your director, your agency head wants to do there.
So in other words, are the ethics, are they absolute or are they relative?
What do you mean?
I mean, do you have ethics that are just absolute, you can't do it, or is it relative to each situation? So could the president get an A1 person?
No.
Even though it's not okay.
No, so this is the difference. He can give that, use his discretion for the nonprofit, right? But he has no discretion for the for-profit. The for-profit, even if they were to create a policy that allowed it, the board would say that policy does not give somebody a right to violate the law, right? It's just like if you had a policy and it said you could get in your car and speed from here to down to Seattle, and that would be okay. If you got pulled over, guess what the trooper or the policeman is going to tell you? Yeah, that's a good policy. Sign here, press hard, 5 copies. So, so agencies can make policy or make their policies a lot stricter than the law, but they can't make them any more lenient than the law. So if the law is that you can't use any resources for profit business at work, then that's what the law is. Agencies can't create a policy that says anything different, okay? But there are some things that are absolute. And business seems to be one of them. If you're doing business for either a private company or your own company at work, the board's going to hold even a one-time use of a state resource. It could be the building. It could be sending off one email regarding that business. It could be one phone call to your business partner at work on a state phone, and that's all it takes. Okay, and so that's about as absolute as it gets, I guess. So there's some of those, and we'll talk about what those are when we get to the use of resources. Okay, so no for profit and maybe for nonprofit, depending on what your director or head wants to do. Very good. All right, so for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about the rules, and there's about 5 of them that we're going to talk about. And the one that comes up the most is conflicts of interest, right? What is a conflict of interest? How do I know when I'm in a conflict of interest, and what do I do to get out of it once I'm in it? So let's talk about some conflicts of interest. So this is what a conflict of interest is. It could involve the concept of bias, right? I know somebody, or they're my relative, so I'm going to be biased in any decision that I make regarding them. So if that's the case, I want to make sure I recuse myself from any decision regarding somebody I know. A good friend or a relative. I got to remove myself from that discussion. Or it could be a benefit. It could be putting money into your own pocket, right? So that's kind of what these rules are geared around. It's about bias and it's about benefit. So this is kind of in a nutshell what the rule says, and it's not word for word, but this kind of gives you an idea what it really means. It says you cannot have a direct or indirect financial interest, engage in a business or transaction, professional activity, incur any obligation with anybody that you regulate or contract with. This kind of goes back to the painting scenario we had early on, right? You regulate the students, and this is the rule that says you can't do it. And the board has really taken any gray area out of this. If you regulate somebody, or you've done contract with that, or you're in negotiation of a contract with them, and you conduct private business with them, that's a violation, regardless if there's any ill intent or you're given or receiving any special deal from that business transaction. If you do it, it's going to be a violation of the rules. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So what kind of conflicts are we talking about? Potential conflict of interest. What do you guys think? I don't think so, but could be. Types of conflicts. These are the ones, and there's many types, but these are 3 that we see probably most often. Mind your guys' way. So we see private business transaction. That's the one we just talked about, where we're doing actual business with people that we regulate or contract with. This could fall in the line if you're a supervisor or manager doing business with somebody that works for you. If you're loaning money or borrowing money from people that work for you, you can't sell them things. You can't buy things from them. You can't give them your condo in Maui, when you're not using it, type of thing. You can't enter into any type of business, personal business transaction with the people that you regulate. Okay, you guys with me there?
So these all apply to the legislature too?
No, well, remember, they're in a different branch of government, right? So they kind of have their own rules, and they do apply. They apply to everybody, but they have their own little twist on them. And if you followed some of the things that have been going on with the legislative ethics board lately, you might wonder what applies. But they do apply. So that's private business. The other one is volunteer activities, and probably for a lot of you guys were involved in outside activities on committees or boards somewhere else. And if they're kind of related to your day job, your job here at the college, you got to be very careful not to cross lines or enter into conflicts. If they have no relation to what you do here at the college, chances are you're not ever going to be in a conflict. But if it's closely related to what you do here, you got to be very careful. So here's an example. Let's just say that I'm on a board, a homeowners association board. I'm a board member, and I also work for Department of Natural Resources as their permit guy to allow bridges to be built over water. Before a bridge can be built over water, I have to approve the permit, right? And in our homeowners association, we want to put a little footbridge across a river that runs through our property. Okay, and we're discussing that at a board meeting. Am I in a conflict of interest situation? Okay, that's the key number 1. I have to recognize that that's a conflict for me to be part of this discussion. Why is it going to be a conflict?
Regulatory relationship.
because I'm the guy potentially that could be looking through that permit and approving or not approving it, right? So I'm in a conflict. So first step is recognizing, okay, that's a conflict. Now how do I get out of it? So what do you guys think? How do I get out of this conflict that I'm in? I have to recuse myself, but who do I recuse, or where do I recuse myself from?
On the board.
Okay, I have to recuse myself from the board because I can't go to my boss and say, boss, I can't do my work because I'm on this board and we're going to do this, right? So you can't recuse yourself from work, but you can recuse yourself from the board, and that's what you should do. What else should you do? You have to notify your supervisor. That's really probably the first thing you should do, right? Because when you should go to your supervisor and say, boss, look, I'm on this board. We're going to we're talking about putting a bridge across the body of water that goes through our property, and so we're going to be filing a permit through us. And so I'm just letting you know that probably a good idea that I not handle that process. So when that permit comes in, the boss can then make a determination. Maybe there's nobody else that can do it, right? So then I'm stuck doing it. Not the ideal situation, but if that's all there is, then that's what happens. That decision is made by the supervisor, though, not me. If I have to do it, it's made by somebody else. The other thing is to be transparent about this whole process. Document the fact that if you're the supervisor or manager that this person comes, you document it that, hey, look, the conflict was recognized, it was brought to the attention of the college, and this is how we dealt with it. We screened him or her from that process when it came in, and they had nothing to do with it, and the permit was approved or not approved based on the merits of the permit, right? And so it's really recuse, notify, recuse, and then just be transparent and real clear in our documentation of that, okay? And probably in this situation, it's going to be a bad thing anyway, right? Because regardless if we get the permit or not, just me being on the board, and if people know that that's the kind of work I do, some people are going to look at that and say, well, the only reason you got it is because Dave works for DNR in the permitting office, and that's why you want to make sure that it's documented clearly, so when people look into that, they can say, you know what, it is what it is. It was taken care of the way we would expect it to be taken care of. And then the last one that we might find ourselves in is professional conflicts. And these are the conflicts that we involve, and these are strictly biased type of conflicts that we find ourselves in. These are the ones that we get involved in, or either people that we know, or maybe their relatives, and maybe if you're working is it applications where new students come in and fill out the application? So you're in that department that takes in new students, and you review their applications, and you determine if they're eligible to come here or not, and then you send them a letter that they can come here or not. But you see, in all that process, there's maybe a relative or a friend that's in there that may not quite meet the what's required to come here, but you kind of bump it up anyway. Okay, so that's the kind of conflicts. Because you know that person, what should you do if you're in that situation? If you get an application of somebody that you know, or maybe a relative, and you're the person that makes a decision, pass it off, right? Give it to somebody else. Recuse yourself from that process, notify your supervisor of the relationship, and let it go the way it goes, but you're not going to be part of it. Okay, a good example of that is when I first became to the board, within my first 2 weeks of being at the board, Melanie DeLeon, our director at that time, brought 2 cases over and put them on my desk. And there were 2 cases of Washington State troopers that I had just had coffee with a couple of weeks ago when I was working for the State Patrol, and I would consider them friends. So how do you think I handled that? Closed up the books, scrubbed my eyes, forgot whatever I saw, brought them back to Melanie and said, look, Melanie, I know these people. I would consider them friends. I mean, I'll do it if you want me to do it, but I'm letting you know that I think there might be a conflict here. Well, she agreed to just keep it, easy and safe, that she would take over those investigations. She did them. I was screened totally from those, a screening memo was put in those case files, so if anybody had questions, they would know not to come talk to Dave about those cases. And when I would get in on my computer in the morning, fired up to see what cases I had open, those cases would not show on my case log, right? Because I was being screened from them, and that protects me, and that protects the agency as well. And that really is helpful because at that time, I still knew a lot of people in the patrol, and I would be getting phone calls from all my buddies. What do you know about these 2 guys? What are they doing? I know nothing. And so I could do that with a straight face, and because I didn't, I knew absolutely nothing about those. So that's professional conflicts. So that's the conflicts. Now how do we handle them? Oh, I guess we got to talk about one more. that's the basic conflict rule. This next one we're going to talk about is when you have a financial interest in a conflict. And it's the same rule, except now there's a financial component to it, right? You're going to actually put some money in your own pocket. And this is how this might work. Let's say that I've been tapped by the president to put on a year-ending gala to honor all the great work that you guys have done and employees of the college. And so the first thing I have to do is I have to hire a caterer to come and put on that big banquet. Well, my wife runs a catering business. Okay, and so can my wife put in maybe the bid to do that job? If I'm the person who's going to pick who does it?
She can put the bid in, but you have to find somebody else to make the decision.
Very good. Can we? It wouldn't be fair to my wife to tell her, yeah, you can't do that work because I happen to be the guy making the decision, right? So, I mean, that would be the case if I couldn't recuse myself. But so I would have to recuse myself. I would have to give that job to somebody else, right? So who would I give it to? Would I give it to a peer or maybe a subordinate? Yeah, it's better to give it to somebody above you, right? Somebody that has no direct influence over you or you have over them, right?
How far would that go down in your world of acquaintances, friendships, relatives, where you have your...
Yeah, that's a good question. And really relatives, and there's a definition of what, and I don't know if you guys have a definition of what a relative is, and there's, the wife, sons, daughters, husband, father-in-law, mother-in-law, grandfather, grandparents, and the list is there. But so that's a for sure thing, if it's a relative and it falls within that group. But friends are more iffy, right? Depends on how really good friends they are. I mean, if you know them and every now and then you say hi to them at the grocery store, that's not what they're looking at here. But if these are folks that you grew up with, your families have spent time together forever, you go hunting and camping with them, and you go on vacations together, then those are the friends that might create a problem for you. And it really comes down to the investigation and how close they are. So, but if you're feeling that you're in that position and this is somebody that you might not be able to make a biased decision on, or somebody looking from the outside in might not think that a biased decision was made, the best way to get out of that is just recuse yourself, move on, give it to somebody else and let them deal with it. Okay? Okay, let's move on. So this is, and we talked about all these already. How do we handle? We abstain, we disclose. Some agencies have policies. Yes, question.
So what if you had a situation where you wanted to sell your car to a coworker or Seahawk tickets, or it's not like a business, but it's something like that?
A coworker, a peer, that's okay, but you couldn't do it to one of your subordinates. You couldn't sell your Seahawk tickets to one of your subordinates. Okay, even though you're right, it's not a business, but that is a business relation. It's an interaction between you, a business interaction with somebody that you supervise. Okay, and it's very specific to the folks that you have direct supervision over, right? So if you're the manager and there's a supervisor below you, and then he supervises 10 people, and it's one of those people, may not be an issue depending on how far down you go, right? So the boss, he supervises or she supervises everybody, so that's not going to apply to everybody. It's only going to apply to those few people right below that position. Right? It's not going to go all the way down to the working ranks. Okay, that help answer your question at all? Okay. So some agencies have policies or procedures, and I'm not sure if you guys do, and to kind of give you guidance on how to, if you find yourself in a conflict situation, on how you can help get out of it or keep from getting in trouble. Department of Social Health Services, if you've ever read some good conflicts, if we ever wanted to read some good conflicts of interest policies, they have some of the best that I've seen. My guess is because their employees are always in those situations where there's conflicts of interest, are near, and they have to be very cautious on how they deal with a lot of things. So the agencies are trying to protect their employees by giving them good guidance, and that's from the procedure manual policies. And then we can do screening memos like we talked about, and this is not something that's mandatory, right? But if you want to protect the employee, if you want to document that you're screening that employee from any decision, you can do that. You can put a screening memo into the case file or file to just let people know that this person is recused from the process and he is, or they are totally out of it from that point on. Oops, did I go too far? Nope. Okay, so those were conflicts of interest. Any questions on conflicts of interest? And these are the ones that really, folks, it's really going to be up to you. The very first step is to realize, okay, I'm in a conflict of interest, or I'm in a potential situation where somebody might be looking at this and think that something, either from a bias perspective, that something's not going to be fair, or from a financial interest perspective, something's not right. And if you find yourself, and I think for the most part, we know when we're there, right? We get that, maybe the hair stands on the back of the head, or we get a feeling that, this is probably just not right. And if we get there, that's the first step. So once we get there, we need to then start looking and asking questions a little bit further, right? What do we do? Where do we go next? Yes?